My granddaughter was afraid to go near the storm cellar. Not the way kids are afraid of spiders or the dark, this was different. She'd go rigid and quiet every time she walked past it in the backyard, and she'd never once asked me what was down there, the way curious kids usually do. Last Saturday morning, she set a folded piece of notebook paper on the kitchen table beside my coffee mug, gave me one look I'll never forget, and walked out to the porch. The note said, "Grandpa Frank, I need you to check the storm cellar tonight. The old wooden box behind the shelves. Please go alone and don't tell Sandra. I'm scared, and I didn't know who else to tell." I had to read it twice before my hands started shaking. But to understand why those words hit me the way they did, I have to go back 8 months, to the morning I buried my wife. Carol and I had been married 41 years. We met at a church social in Clarksville, Tennessee when I was 22 and she was 19. And she laughed at something I said, and that was it for me, right there on the spot. We raised 2 kids in the house I still live in, a wood-frame place on a gravel road outside of town with a big yard and a vegetable garden. Carol tended like it was her life's work, because in a lot of ways, it was. She put up tomatoes every August. She grew herbs along the south-facing fence. She knew the name of every bird that visited the feeder by the kitchen window. The cancer moved fast. 10 months from diagnosis to the end, and there was nothing fast about how it felt from the inside. When she was gone, the house didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like a museum built around someone who wasn't coming back. My daughter Karen lives in Nashville, about an hour away. She came for the funeral with her husband and my granddaughter Lily, who was 14 at the time and had adored her grandmother. My son Paul lived in Portland and couldn't get back as often as he wanted, but he called every few days to check on me. I was managing. Not well, but managing. It was Carol's younger brother Derek who suggested moving in. Derek and his wife Sandra had been living in a rented apartment in Murfreesboro. His lease was coming up, he said, and it just didn't make sense to renew it when I was out here alone in a 4-bedroom house, clearly struggling to keep things together. "You need somebody here, Frank," he told me, his voice full of the kind of concern that sounds rehearsed if you hear it enough times. Carol would have wanted someone looking after you. I didn't want to say no to Derek. He was my last real connection to Carol. He had her same dark eyes, her same way of tilting his head when he was listening. And he was right that I was struggling. I'd let the vegetable garden die. I'd been eating cereal for dinner more nights than I cared to admit, and the silence in the house was a physical thing by then, heavy and constant. So, in October, 6 weeks after the funeral, Derek and Sandra moved in. The first few weeks were fine, or seemed that way. Sandra was efficient. She cooked real meals, kept the kitchen clean, organized the pantry. Derek helped me fix the gutter on the north side of the house that had been pulling away from the fascia all summer. Lily started coming out on weekends more often because Karen thought it would be good for me to have family around, and having Lily there genuinely helped. She'd sit with me on the porch after dinner and we'd watch the fireflies come out and talk about her school, her friends, the book she was reading. But Sandra had a way of redirecting things. She had a gift for walking into a room and shifting its center of gravity toward herself. If Lily and I were in the middle of a conversation, Sandra would drift in and start asking Lily about her homework, her extracurriculars. Had she eaten enough dinner? Friendly, caring on the surface. But Lily would go quiet in that particular way she had, polite and closed off, and eventually she'd find a reason to excuse herself. I noticed, but I told myself I was being uncharitable. Sandra was trying. Then the forgetting started. Small things at first. I couldn't find my reading glasses. I left the back door unlocked overnight. I asked Derek the same question about the truck's inspection sticker twice in one morning, which he mentioned at dinner that evening in front of Sandra. "You already asked him that, Frank," she said, her voice patient and a little concerned. "Are you sleeping all right?" "I worry about you. I figured it was grief. I figured it was the disruption of routine, the stress of adjusting to people living in my space. Carol had managed so much of the household detail, and I was only now realizing how much I'd leaned on her for that. Maybe I had always been more scattered than I thought. But Sandra kept a careful record of every lapse. She mentioned them to Karen during phone calls. I found this out later. She was building a picture, brick by brick, of a man who couldn't manage on his own. "Your father left the stove on again, Karen. He forgot he'd already taken his heart medication and almost doubled his dose. I caught it just in time. I'm worried this might be more than grief." I didn't know about those conversations yet. What I knew was that my daughter started calling more frequently with a certain careful quality in her voice, like she was feeling for something fragile. "Dad, How are you really doing? Are you getting enough sleep? Have you thought about talking to a doctor about your memory? I told her I was fine. She didn't sound convinced. Sandra had taken over my medication about 3 weeks after they moved in. It started reasonably enough. She noticed I kept forgetting whether I'd taken my blood pressure pill and suggested she just set it out with a glass of water each morning so I wouldn't have to think about it. One less thing to keep track of, she said, smiling. I thought that was considerate. I should have asked more questions. The forgetfulness got worse. I started losing track of conversations entirely. Whole discussions I had no memory of the next day. There was a morning I came downstairs and found myself standing in the kitchen with no idea what day it was or why I'd gotten up. Sandra found me there and guided me to a chair with a gentle hand on my elbow, the way you'd guide someone very old or very sick. Let me get you some water, Frank. You rest. Derek started talking about long-term plans, not pushing exactly, but mentioning things. There was a continuing care community outside of Murfreesboro that was supposed to be very well run. A cousin of a friend had moved there and loved it. You don't have to decide anything now, he said, but it might be worth a tour. Just to see. I was 63 years old. I had managed my own finances, run my own business, a small HVAC company I'd built from the ground up over 30 years before selling it at retirement, and made every major decision in my life without anyone's help. And I was standing in my own kitchen being told to consider a care facility. Something in me pushed back, quietly, without showing it, but it was there. Lily started acting strange sometime around Thanksgiving. She came out 2 weekends in a row and was almost completely silent, which wasn't like her. She'd always been talkative with me, easy and open, the way grandchildren sometimes are with grandparents, in a way they're not with their own parents. Now she sat on the porch with her hands in her hoodie pocket and gave one-word answers to my questions. When I asked if everything was all right, she said yes too quickly and glanced toward the kitchen window. The third weekend she came, she knocked on my bedroom door after everyone else had gone to bed. She stood in the doorway looking smaller than her 14 years. Can I talk to you, Grandpa? Of course. Come in. She sat on the edge of the chair by the window and was quiet for a long moment. Then, I saw something. A few weeks ago, when you were all at Derek's cousin's birthday dinner. I stayed here because I had a headache, remember? I did remember, though the memory had a murky quality that bothered me. I was bored and went out back to look at the stars, and the storm cellar was open. The light was on inside. She stopped. I looked down through the door and Sandra was down there. She didn't hear me. She was going through a box and writing things down on a notepad. What kind of things? I don't know. Papers. But Grandpa, she hesitated. She had a folder with your name on it, and she was taking pictures of things with her phone. She looked, I don't know, sneaky, like she didn't want anyone to see. Before she could say more, Sandra's voice came from the hallway. Lily? Sweetie, it's almost 11. You should be getting to bed. The bedroom door was open. Lily went stiff. Coming, she called, her voice steady. She looked at me and something passed across her face. Not here, not now. She stood up and said good night, and I watched her go down the hall with Sandra's hand briefly on her shoulder, steering. I didn't sleep that night. Over the following 2 weeks, I watched more carefully. I watched how Sandra made my coffee in the mornings with her back to me, taking just a little longer than necessary. I watched how she managed the kitchen so that she was always the one to prepare my food and my drinks. I watched how she positioned herself whenever Lily and I were together, drifting nearby, listening. I also stopped drinking the coffee. I told Sandra my stomach had been bothering me in the mornings and I was cutting back on caffeine for a while. I started making my own instant coffee in a travel mug I kept in my bedroom. I started eating breakfast foods. I could prepare myself fruit, toast, cereal, and within about 4 days, my head began to clear. Not dramatically, gradually, the way fog burns off in the late morning. I started sleeping better. I stopped losing track of conversations. The strange, cloudy feeling I'd been wading through for weeks began to lift, and what replaced it was a cold, quiet alertness that I recognized as my own mind coming back online. The night Lily left her note on the kitchen table was a Saturday in late January. Karen had dropped her off the evening before and was picking her up after church Sunday morning. After I read the note and sat with it for a few minutes, I folded it and put it in my shirt pocket and went out to the porch where Lily was sitting with her hands wrapped around a hot chocolate. I'll go tonight, I said quietly. After midnight. She nodded without looking at me. Then, be careful, Grandpa. She checks on the house sometimes at night. I've heard her footsteps. I waited until the house was fully silent. Derek and Sandra slept in the guest room at the far end of the hall, and I could hear Derek's faint snoring well before midnight. I put on my boots in the dark, took my flashlight from the nightstand, and went out the back door as slowly as I could manage, easing the screen door shut behind me. The storm cellar was about 30 feet from the back porch. It was an old concrete shelter Carol's father had built in the 50s, accessible through a pair of horizontal doors set into the ground. We used it to store canning jars, a chest freezer, some old tools. I hadn't been down there in at least 2 years. The padlock on the door was new. I hadn't put it there. I stood looking at it in the beam of my flashlight for a moment. Then I went back to the garage and found the bolt cutters on the second shelf where they'd always been, and I cut through the shackle and opened the doors and went down the concrete steps into the cold. The shelves were still there along the left wall. Carol's mason jars still lined up in neat rows. The chest freezer hummed in the corner, and behind it, pushed against the far wall, was a wooden box I didn't recognize. Heavy, dark-stained oak, about the size of a large toolbox. There was a combination lock on the hasp, but it wasn't latched, just threaded through and hanging open. Sandra had been in a hurry, or wasn't expecting anyone to find it. Inside was a folder labeled with my name and a document printed on legal paper. I held my flashlight closer and read. It was a petition for guardianship. A formal legal document asserting that I, Francis Dale Mercer, age 63, was suffering from progressive cognitive decline consistent with early-stage dementia, and that Derek Allen Whitmore, as a family member who had been providing full-time care, was the appropriate person to be designated my legal guardian with full authority over my finances, property, and medical decisions. There were supporting documents. A letter, signed with a doctor's name I didn't recognize, describing an evaluation that had never taken place. A log of my supposed episodes of confusion, dates, times, descriptions in Sandra's handwriting. Bank statements showing transfers I hadn't authorized, moving money from my savings account into a joint account I had never opened. There was a deed transfer document for the house, unsigned but complete, with Derek listed as the new owner. And there was a printed email chain. I held the flashlight close and read it carefully. The conversation was between Sandra and my daughter Karen. I read it 3 times to make sure I understood what I was seeing. Karen had known for at least 2 months. Not all of it. The email chain suggested she believed what Sandra had been telling her, that I was genuinely declining, that I genuinely needed someone to manage my affairs. But there were lines in Karen's messages that made the floor feel unsteady under me. I just want to make sure Dad is protected. If the house goes to Derek and you, I need to know Lily and I are taken care of too. What did you say about the Nashville property? And Sandra's reply. Once guardianship is established, we can structure things however makes the most sense for the whole family. Derek and I have always planned to include you. My daughter, my own daughter, had been promised a share. I stood in that cold cellar for a long moment with the beam of the flashlight cutting across those pages, and I made myself breathe, and I made myself think. I photographed everything with my phone, every single page, and uploaded the photos to the cloud storage account I'd set up when I ran the business, and never closed. Then I put everything back exactly as I'd found it, replaced the cut lock with a trigger lock from an old rifle case that looked similar enough in the dark, and went back inside. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark until 4 in the morning. The next morning, Sandra brought me my coffee with her usual smile, and I thanked her and set it aside and had my own. She watched me for a fraction of a second longer than was natural, then moved on to making Derek's breakfast. Lily came downstairs, saw the travel mug in my hand, and let out a very small, very quiet breath of relief. After church, I asked Karen to stay for a few minutes after she picked Lily up. Sandra and Derek had gone to the grocery store. We sat in the front room and I put my phone on the coffee table with the photos of the email chain on the screen, and I watched my daughter's face. She went pale very quickly. Dad, I need you to listen, I said. All of it. Then you can talk. I told her everything. What I'd found in the cellar. What the documents said. What was being done to me, and had been done to me, and what she had agreed to in those emails, even if she hadn't understood the full scope of it. I told her about the medication, the forgetfulness that had started after Sandra took over my mornings and stopped when I stopped drinking her coffee. I told her I had already scheduled a doctor's appointment for the following Tuesday to get blood work done, and that I was seeing my attorney the day after. Karen cried. Not theatrical, crying quiet, ashamed crying, her hands pressed flat on her knees. I didn't know she was drugging you, she said. I thought it was real. She called me every week, Dad. She had all these examples, these dates and times. I thought you were actually, she stopped. I was scared. I thought I was losing you the way we lost, Mom. I believed her. I believed she'd been deceived, and that her grief had made her easy to deceive. But I also looked at those lines in her emails again, the ones about the Nashville property and being taken care of, and I knew it wasn't that simple. Love and greed can live in the same person. That's one of the harder things to accept about people you love. Here's what you're going to do, I said. You're going to go home. You're not going to call Derek or Sandra. You're not going to give any sign that anything has changed, and you're going to let me handle what comes next. She asked if she could help. I told her she could, when the time came. My attorney was a woman named Margaret Holloway, and I'd used her firm for the business sale and the estate planning Carol and I had done together. She met with me Tuesday afternoon after my doctor's appointment, and when I finished laying out what I'd found, she set down her pen and looked at me for a moment. Frank, this is elder fraud. The forged medical evaluation alone is a serious crime. The unauthorized account transfers, the fraudulent power of attorney, the forged deed, these aren't civil matters. These are felonies. I know. I want to talk about the medication issue specifically. Did your doctor confirm anything today? I pulled out the paperwork from Dr. Elaine Foster's office. I'd gone in that morning and told her exactly what I suspected, brought in 2 of the pills I'd pocketed from the nightstand lineup over the previous weeks, not taking them, just saving them quietly. Elaine had drawn blood for a full tox panel, and she'd looked at the pills and told me she'd be in touch within 48 hours. She'd also done a full cognitive evaluation on the spot and had given me a written summary stating that my cognitive function was entirely normal with no signs of impairment. Margaret looked at the summary and nodded slowly. This is going to be important. The guardianship petition hinges on your being mentally impaired. This document cuts the legs out from under it before it's even filed. What about the account transfers? I've already drafted an emergency motion to freeze any joint accounts bearing your name and to flag your primary accounts against any new authorized signatories. I'll file it this afternoon. She paused. Frank, I also need to ask you about your daughter. I told her what Karen had known and what she hadn't. Margaret listened carefully. If she didn't know the full extent of the scheme and genuinely believed the cognitive decline was real, she has significant exposure but may avoid criminal charges if she cooperates. That's ultimately something for prosecutors to assess, not me. But if she's willing to give a statement, it will help your case considerably. I said I'd talk to her. The next 2 days were the longest of my life. I went through the motions at home, ate Sandra's dinners, sat in front of the news, said goodnight at reasonable hours. I was pleasant. I was tired looking. I was, as far as Sandra could tell, the same foggy and easily managed man I'd been for the past few months. Elaine called on Thursday. The tox panel had found elevated levels of a benzodiazepine in my blood, consistent with regular long-term exposure. She was writing a formal report and would be available to testify if necessary. She told me in a quiet voice that what had been done to me was something she'd seen before, more often than people realized, and that I'd been right to trust my instincts. That evening, Karen came by with Lily under the cover of a regular visit. While Sandra was in the kitchen, Karen sat across from Derek in the living room, with her hands folded, and told him, calmly, that she'd been talking to an attorney and that she'd been advised to cooperate fully with any investigation. I watched Derek's face as she said it. I watched the color leave it. After they left, Sandra found me on the porch. She stood beside me for a minute, looking out at the yard. Karen seemed tense tonight. She's been stressed with work, I said. She nodded, but when she went back inside, she walked quickly. The police came on a Friday morning while Derek and Sandra were both home. Detective Roy Callahan from the County Sheriff's Financial Crimes Unit came to the front door with 2 deputies and a warrant, and I opened the door and let them in. I had already taken my important documents, the real ones, the copies, everything to Margaret's office the day before. I watched from the porch as they walked Sandra and Derek out separately. Sandra said nothing. Derek looked at me once over his shoulder, and I didn't look away. The next few months were complicated in the way that real things always are not clean, not simple, with edges that kept catching you when you thought you'd move past them. Sandra was charged with elder fraud, forgery, financial exploitation, and 1 count related to the medication that the district attorney was pursuing aggressively. Derek was charged alongside her as a co-conspirator. The forged doctor's letter led to a separate investigation into whoever had signed it, which turned out to be a real physician who had done a very brief phone consultation and signed paperwork Sandra had presented as routine forms. He had his own trouble to deal with. Karen gave a full statement. She was not charged. She lost something anyway, you could see it in her face for a long time afterward. The particular grief of realizing that you were used by someone you trusted, and that your own fear made it easier for them to use you. She and I talked about it honestly, more honestly than we'd talked about most things in years. And I think that part of what came out of everything was actually a better understanding between us. Not the kind of understanding you'd choose, but the real kind. Lily was the one I worried about, 14 years old and carrying a secret for weeks, watching something wrong happen in her grandfather's house and not knowing who to trust with it. I sat with her on the porch the weekend after the arrests and asked her how she was doing. "Okay," she said. "Then, did I do the right thing? Telling you?" "You did exactly the right thing," I said. "You were the bravest person in this whole situation, and I want you to know, I know that." She was quiet for a minute. I was really scared she'd figure out I knew. She was always watching. She was. But you were smarter. Lily started coming out most weekends after that, not because she felt obligated, but because she wanted to, and we'd work in the vegetable garden that I had cleared and replanted in the spring with the same varieties Carol used to grow. Lily turned out to have an instinct for it. She knew when to water and when to leave things alone, which I thought was a kind of wisdom you can't really teach. Sandra was sentenced to 7 years. Derek got 5 with the possibility of parole after 3 for cooperation. The money that had been transferred was fully recovered, all of it, because Margaret had moved fast enough. The house stayed mine, which is to say it stayed exactly what it had always been, the place Carol and I built our life, with the herb garden along the south fence and the bird feeder by the kitchen window and the big yard I still mow myself on Saturday mornings. I changed the locks on the storm cellar and put a proper padlock on it, one with a key that stays on my keychain. I make my own coffee now. I set out my own medications. I see my doctor regularly, and my blood pressure is under control, and my mind is as sharp as it ever was, which is to say fairly sharp, with the ordinary forgetfulness that belongs to being 63 and not to being drugged by someone who wanted what you'd spent a lifetime building. I think about Carol sometimes and wonder what she would have made of all of it. She had always been careful about Derek, not unkind, but careful, in the way she was careful about things she sensed rather than knew. I used to tease her for it. I don't anymore. What I know now, and try to hold on to, is this. Being older does not make you less. It does not make you a problem to be managed or a resource to be extracted. The people who treated me as those things were wrong, and they were caught, and they will spend years in a cell where they can think about the difference between a person and an opportunity. But more than the legal outcome, more than the sentences and the account numbers and the recovered deed, what I carry with me is the image of a 14-year-old girl on a cold January night, sitting on a dark porch with her hands wrapped around a hot chocolate, afraid and uncertain, and doing the right thing anyway. I didn't know who else to tell, she'd written. She told me, and that was everything. I tell this not because my story is unusual, it isn't, which is the part that should concern all of us, but because the people it happens to are usually too ashamed or too confused or too isolated to say anything at all. If you are an older person and something in your house doesn't feel right, trust that feeling. It is not paranoia. It is not confusion. It is your mind doing exactly what it was built to do, which is to recognize a threat and sound an alarm. Listen to it. If someone in your life is managing too much for you, ask yourself when you agreed to that arrangement and whether it still makes sense. Keep your important documents somewhere only you can access. Maintain relationships with your doctor and your attorney that don't pass through a third party. Know what is in your bank accounts. And if a young person in your life is watching you with worried eyes and has something to tell you, make the time, make the space, put down whatever you're doing and listen. Sometimes the people who see most clearly are the ones who've been told they're too young to understand. Lily graduates high school in 2 years. She wants to study environmental science, something to do with soil health and sustainable agriculture, which I could have predicted from the way she handles seedlings. I plan to be at that graduation, sitting in a folding chair in gymnasium bleachers, perfectly lucid, drinking coffee I made myself. It's a good plan. I intend to keep it.